Exercise encompasses a diverse array of modalities, adaptable to individual preferences and objectives. Amidst this versatility, certain exercises and principles emerge as indispensable components of a well-rounded fitness regimen. When prioritizing not only physical fitness but also long-term health and well-being, integrating these foundational elements becomes imperative. In the forthcoming discussion, we delve into the notable health and fitness benefits associated with a particular form of exercise, elucidating why it warrants consideration by individuals seeking comprehensive fitness and vitality. Additionally, practical insights will be provided on the execution and integration of this exercise modality into one's weekly routine. Furthermore, we will engage in an informative discussion aimed at dispelling prevalent misconceptions surrounding lactic acid and its effects on muscle physiology. This promises to be an enlightening exploration. Now, transitioning to our main focus, what precisely constitutes this pivotal form of exercise? It is none other than cardiovascular training, often regarded with apprehension by some but embraced fervently by others. Specifically, we refer to Zone 2 training, characterized by its emphasis on cultivating aerobic capacity through steady-state cardio at a moderate intensity level. Subsequently, we will delve into methods for identifying and integrating Zone 2 training into your exercise regimen. Well, let's first answer this question of why should everyone consider this type of training, because it makes sense for somebody like an endurance athlete or people who are interested in long-distance running or long-distance cycling. Makes sense for them to do this type of training. But what about somebody like a power lifter, or maybe even someone like me who likes to play a lot of basketball? Because I can tell you, we didn't do a lot of Zone 2 training to get in shape for basketball. Well, we're going to answer this by talking about the incredible physiological adaptation and changes that occur within your body due to Zone 2 training, and how that translates to what I would consider universal fitness and health benefits. Zone 2 training will strengthen the muscles of the heart, which obviously will help to improve fitness, and this can lead to improvements in resting heart rate as well as even blood pressure, which can help to reduce your overall risk of cardiovascular conditions over the long term. Zone 2 training also has an amazing effect on your muscles, specifically the slow-twitch muscle cells or the slow-twitch muscle fibers. Now, if watch this before, you've likely heard us talk about slow-twitch versus fast-twitch muscle fibers and even some of the intermediate fibers. But if you are new to this, let me give you a quick synopsis on fiber type. Within the complex structure of a muscle, one can discern an intricate network comprising myriad muscle cells or fibers. These fibers exhibit distinct characteristics, with some categorized as slow-twitch fibers. Notably, these fibers demonstrate a heightened resistance to fatigue, primarily attributable to their reliance on oxygen for energy production, rendering them conducive to sustained aerobic activities. In contrast, fast-twitch fibers operate in an anaerobically driven manner, affording them the capacity for rapid contraction and enhanced force generation. However, their propensity for fatigue is comparatively heightened, necessitating brief bursts of intense exertion. Activities such as sprinting, jumping, and high-intensity resistance training predominantly engage fast-twitch fibers. The elucidation of these fiber types underscores the rationale behind advocating for the aforementioned training modality, particularly considering its propensity for inducing physiological adaptations within the slow-twitch fibers. Well, we're going to make the case that developing those slow-twitch fibers through Zone 2 training is going to also have some indirect benefits for these fast-twitch fibers. Consistent Zone 2 training helps to promote the development of new capillaries, which are tiny exchange vessels that exchange nutrients and waste products between the bloodstream and the tissues, and muscle tissue would be included in this. So think we're growing more of these tiny tubes or tiny capillaries. They're going to penetrate the muscle tissue, bringing in more blood and more oxygen, which those slow twitch muscle fibers are going to be more than happy to gobble up that extra oxygen during those aerobic activities. And you could see how that could improve fitness. Not only can we bring in more oxygen, but also if we have more capillaries and more blood, we can bring in more of other substances like fats and carbohydrates, which could be utilized to create the energy currency of our muscle cells or muscle fibers, that ATP. Fat is going to be more important in just a second because we're going to talk about how Zone 2 primarily utilizes fat, but bringing in more carbs can also be beneficial to those fast-twitch muscle fibers because they primarily utilize glucose or carbohydrates. And so you can see that's one of our indirect benefits to the fast-twitch fibers through this Zone 2 training. Now, we also want to think it's not just about bringing in more substances to the muscle tissue with this increased capillarization, it's also about being able to pull things out and away from the muscles, things like metabolic byproducts. Therefore, for more effective at removing metabolic byproducts from the muscle that could benefit any of the muscle fiber types. My favorite physiological benefit that occurs with Zone 2 training is that the mitochondria within the slow-twitch muscle fibers will increase in size and therefore their work capacity become more efficient, plus the overall total number of mitochondria will increase in those slow-twitch muscle fibers. And all of us who have taken biology are probably trained to think mitochondria, a powerhouse of the cell, because it creates ATP in the presence of oxygen, and that is true. In addition, from an exercise perspective, again, we are just building more upon this. We have increased the blood flow already. We've increased the amount of oxygen we can bring in, and now that oxygen can be funneled into more mitochondria and create more ATP, which would increase our fitness in our work capacity, but improve on and increasing the mitochondria is more than just about improving our fitness and work capacity. There are tremendous metabolic long-term benefits that occur from developing mitochondria that can help reduce our risk of conditions that plague our society. And I am definitely going to talk about those in just a second. But first, I do need to clear some things up with lactic acid. Lactic acid is a metabolic byproduct from a form of anaerobic metabolism called anaerobic glycolysis. Maybe you've heard of anaerobic glycolysis before, but as the name implies, this is when the cell, or in this case the muscle fiber, breaks down glucose to form ATP in the absence of oxygen. And in general, as exercise intensity increases, this would cause the muscle fibers to rely more on anaerobic glycolysis and would therefore result in a buildup or an accumulation of more lactic acid within the muscle fibers. There are two things that we need to address or clarify with lactic acid. One is that lactic acid under physiological conditions primarily exists as lactate in our bodies. Yes, you could likely get away with using lactic acid and lactate interchangeably, as most people in the exercise physiology know what you're talking about, but they technically are different because as you're going through anaerobic glycolysis and building up lactic acid, it quickly dissociates into lactate and the hydrogen ion. And it's that hydrogen ion that contributes to the acidity that's building up within the muscle fiber. And this acidity does need to be dealt with because this could potentially impair or slow the overall function of the muscle fiber, and this buildup of lactic acid, or what we should more appropriately say lactate, and the hydrogen ion can sometimes give lactate a little bit of a bad rap or mischaracterize it, which is the second thing we need to address. Lactate is sometimes referred to as a metabolic waste product. Yes, we have to manage the accumulating levels that can occur during exercise, but it is not as if it is this toxic substance that our body is trying to rid itself of or excrete. It is a metabolic byproduct because we're going to find that when oxygen becomes more readily available again, say like when you decrease your intensity, or maybe there are some cells or tissues that are close by to those exercising muscles that have more oxygen available. What we are going to see is that lactate can be transported into the mitochondria to make more ATP. So let us use an exercise example to illustrate how cool this is. Let us say we start exercising at a light to moderate intensity, and at that level of intensity, we should have enough oxygen available to produce ATP for our working muscles through mostly aerobic pathways, which means we are primarily going to be recruiting those slow twitch muscle fibers and mostly using fat in the mitochondria as our energy source. However, as we increase the intensity, let us say we are jogging and we increase our running speed, or this could even be applied to certain weight training scenarios. Maybe we are doing multiple repetitions of heavy squats. The point is, we're increasing the intensity, and as we increase that intensity, we're going to have to start recruiting some of those fast twitch muscle fibers and starting to shift to more of those anaerobic pathways like anaerobic glycolysis. And we know that we can only maintain a certain level of intensity for a certain amount of time. The higher the intensity, the less amount of time that we can sustain it before we either have to back off, slow down, or even just rest. And what's happening is we're depleting our ATP while we're accumulating more lactate. So, what is our body going to do about this? Therefore, you will likely notice that when you pull back from a bout of high-intensity exercise or enter this rest and recovery phase, you will be breathing heavily. You might wonder why I would need to breathe heavily if high-intensity exercise mostly requires anaerobic pathways or anaerobic metabolism that does not require oxygen. Well, it is not as the aerobic pathways just shut down. You are essentially getting to this point of intensity where you just can't bring the oxygen into the muscle and the mitochondria and process it fast enough, so then you have to shift to and rely on other energy systems that are faster, like the anaerobic glycolysis. But the drawback of that is they're fast, but they don't produce much ATP, and so you can only sustain that for a short amount of time. And we get to this problem that we mentioned earlier, where we've diminished the ATP within the muscle and also accumulated lactate. And this is one of the main reasons why you're breathing heavily during those rest periods, because you're trying to deal with this. One of the things you're going to do is replenish the ATP by breathing in all that oxygen and replacing it aerobically by utilizing fats and even carbohydrates. But also, we can utilize that lactate that we mentioned earlier. It is almost like hitting two birds with one stone. We need to bring down the lactate, and we can do that when oxygen is present because we can funnel it into the mitochondria, as I mentioned earlier, and help to bolster up ATP even further, which is ridiculously amazing. Therefore, we are going to talk about two pathways that we can deal with this lactate. One, right at the local level, at the muscle we just exercised systemically throughout the body. So, let us say you consistently participate in Zone 2 training. You improve the size and quality of your mitochondria and even increase the overall number within those slow-twitch muscle fibers. Based on that, you could see that that would make you better equipped to process increasing levels of lactate that occur during exercise and even aid in recovery. And yes, it's those slow-twitch muscle fibers that primarily benefit or have those physiological adaptations from Zone 2 training, like creating these higher quality and higher number of mitochondria. But again, that doesn't mean that the fast-twitch fibers cannot benefit from this. The fast-twitch fibers produce the majority of lactate, but they do not have many mitochondria. Therefore, they are going to need a little bit of help processing the lactate they produce. And one of the cool things that can happen is the lactate produced in, say, a fast-twitch fiber could be transferred to a neighboring slow-twitch fiber within the same muscle, consequently facilitating expedited recovery for fast-twitch fibers between successive bouts of high-intensity exercise. Nonetheless, it is imperative to acknowledge the inherent limitations in this process. Specifically, there exists a ceiling on the amount of lactate that can be metabolized within the muscle at a localized level. While individuals with higher levels of fitness and mitochondrial density may exhibit enhanced lactate processing capabilities, there remains a threshold beyond which lactate accumulation surpasses the muscle's capacity for utilization. This phenomenon, known as lactate spillover, entails the overflow of excess lactate into the bloodstream, resulting in elevated lactate levels proportional to the intensity of exercise. Employing a lactate meter, such as the one I utilize at home, offers a practical means of delineating one's Zone 2 threshold through the measurement of lactate levels. We will get into that in just a second, but once it is in the bloodstream, you now can have multiple other cells, and tissues help you process this lactate, and one of those is the amazing heart. In addition, yes, I am a little ashamed of this because we are in an anatomy lab and I tried to draw a real heart, just did not work well. Therefore, this is what we get, but the amazing heart has cardiac muscle fibers that also can improve its mitochondrial number and their quality through consistent training so that lactate can go into the muscle cells of the heart, get into the mitochondria of the heart muscle fibers, and make more ATP. We can also send that lactate to the liver. Now, the liver does something a little different. Instead of funneling it into mitochondria and creating more ATP out of it, it will convert that lactate into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis, which is beneficial because that can help maintain blood glucose levels, and that glucose could be utilized later on for future production of ATP. So how do you do Zone 2 training and find your Zone 2? Well, at the beginning of the video, we mentioned Zone 2 is a form of steady-state cardio done at a moderate intensity, and that steady state is important. When you are doing Zone 2 training, you do not want to be bouncing between the different training zones or different training intensities and just average it out to Zone 2. You want to stay just within that Zone 2 throughout the exercise session, and that will give you the physiological benefits and adaptations. Now, if you have never heard of the different training zones, that is okay. The endurance athlete world talks about these training zones a lot. Sometimes they have 5 zones, 6 zones, and 7 zones. I like the 5, but 1 would be the easiest. 5 would be the hardest. And again, we are going to mostly focus on Zone 2, obviously, and we're going to talk about how to find it most cheaply, just by yourself up to paying people and buying your equipment. So let us start with the least expensive way and one of the most effective ways to find your Zone 2. And by least expensive, I mean free, and that is the talk test. Zone 2 should be done at a level of intensity where still maintain a conversation with someone. Not at this level of conversation, it needs to be more difficult than that, but if you are on the phone with someone while you are doing Zone 2 training, they could tell that you are exercising. They could tell that you are breathing more heavily, but you could still maintain the majority of that conversation. You might have to take a few breaths in between sentences, but you could get full sentences out, and the nice thing about this is it's fairly accurate when you compare it to laboratory testing, which we'll talk about some of those tests after we get to my favorite method of checking for Zone 2, and that is based upon heart rate zones. Using heart rate zones, or I should say a percentage of your max heart rate to find your Zone 2, is not my favorite, at least initially, because there is some variation in this. Some will say that 60 to 70% of your max heart rate is where you would find your Zone 2. Others will say 65 to 75%. Therefore, you can see there is a wide range there. In addition, you would need to know what your true max heart rate is. There are crude equations to help you with this, like 220 minus your age and some other equations. There are plenty of people where these calculations are quite a bit off, and so if you just do not have any of that data and you are just basing it off these percentages, you may not be in your true Zone 2. Now, if you were to go to a lab and find your actual max heart rate, that could start to narrow it down and make this way of finding your Zone 2 a little bit more accurate, but taking it a step further to the next testing method to get what we call lactate testing is even better. Lactate testing is when you test the amount of lactate in your blood, and we know that Zone 2 occurs at a blood lactate level of about 1.9 to 2.0 millimoles. Therefore, you would want to stay in that 1.9 to 2.0 range throughout your exercise. Now, are you going to go to a professional lab and have this done, or you're going to buy your blood lactate meter? Those are questions you would have to answer for yourself. But the limitation of going to a professional lab is it would tell you your blood lactate on that day at that moment, and you could correlate your 2 or your 1.9 or 2.0 with the heart rate that it occurred at, and you could use that as somewhat of a training protocol. But lactate levels can change and vary from day to day. For example, if you are more fatigued, you had an intense exercise week, you are more fatigued, which could change your blood lactate level and how it correlates with your heart rate, and even improvements in fitness could change this a little bit. Therefore, the most accurate way, you could maybe even consider it the craziest way, $300 to $400 crazy, I guess, because that is what the lactate meter would cost, and you could just test yourself while you are exercising in Zone 2 periodically throughout the week. In addition, just to reiterate, if you are just starting with Zone 2, training that talk test is a good place to start. I've done some nerdy testing on my own where I've run in Zone 2 while talking, and just trying to see if I can stay in it doing the talk test, I've used my lactate meter alongside it, and it's pretty close to that 2 millimole. Therefore, a good place to start. And then, if you're using wearables with heart rate monitors, you can start to narrow in about that range of where your heart rate would be with your Zone 2. But one of the things you're probably also wondering is frequency. How often should I be doing this? Well, When people are first starting and they have not done much exercise at all, we try to get them to at least 1 to 2 hours, starting with the idea of them getting to 3 to 4 hours a week. I like to at least 4 hours a week. And then the next question is, people sometimes say, well, can I lump that time into 1 or 2 sessions? Especially if they're starting in that 1 to the 2 hour range. And if that's all you're going to give me is like 1 to 2 days a week, then we would take it. But the ideal way of doing this for the maximum physiological changes and benefits would be to spread it out throughout the week with 45 minutes to 60-minute sessions about 3 to 4 days a week. Now, Zone 2 training is not the only form of training that would be recommended if someone is concerned about his or her overall fitness, health, and longevity. You'd want to incorporate strength training as well, and ideally even add 1 higher intensity cardio day, like a VO2 max day that we've done a video on, and we'll link that to this video. And people who are just concerned about this overall general health, fitness, and longevity, and they are just wanting to have good strength, good cardiovascular fitness, you can get a pretty good split by doing, say, like 3 weight training or strength training days, 3 cardio days. And you can almost have your cardio and strength training on different days. But if you're throwing a VO2 max session in there as well, sometimes you're going to have to double up some of the cardio and the strength training on the same day. Now, if you were to do a workout where you did like strength at the beginning and your Zone 2 right after it, or vice versa, would you make gains in both of those areas if you consistently maintained your routine over the long term? Absolutely. But if you're one of those who's extremely concerned about maximizing your strength gains and maybe even hypertrophy training, getting a little bit bigger, then it would be best if you separated the workouts by a few hours. Or at least you did your strength training in the morning and your cardio training later afternoon. I do want to repeat one thing that I mentioned earlier. When you are doing Zone 2, you want to stay steady within Zone 2. When people sometimes figure out their heart rate range for their Zone 2, they'll sometimes get into this workout where their heart rate spikes, goes down, goes above Zone 2, below Zone 2. But then when they look at their data after, they're like, oh, my average heart rate was within my Zone 2. You don't want to be doing that. That's not nearly effective. You want to stay right within that Zone 2. I somewhat think of it as this churning and this constant stimulation of your mitochondria. Teaching those mitochondria to utilize and metabolize fats more effectively and creating this metabolic efficiency or even metabolic flexibility. And what you can kind of think of that meaning is that you get good at teaching your body how to maximize the use of your macronutrients. You are using the fats, how you need to use the fats. You are using the carbohydrates, how you are supposed to be using the carbohydrates, which is pretty much the opposite of what occurs with things like metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, and even diabetes. This is one of the most important health benefits of Zone 2 training. This metabolic efficiency or flexibility, and I apologize, it took me so long to get here, but unfortunately these metabolic dysfunctions are pretty prevalent in our society, and for someone with like type 2 diabetes, the body is not processing or metabolizing fats properly. Inadequate carbohydrate metabolism can precipitate the onset of insulin resistance, a precursor to metabolic disorders such as type 2 diabetes. Consequently, identifying effective interventions to mitigate these risks assumes paramount importance. Zone 2 training emerges as a compelling candidate for addressing metabolic dysfunctions and potentially inducing remission in certain cases of type 2 diabetes. Its efficacy in improving insulin sensitivity and metabolic health positions it prominently among preventive measures. Furthermore, I would be remiss if I failed to express my enthusiasm for one of my enduring educational resources, Brilliant. I recently started one of their new lessons called Exploring Data Visually, which is all about analyzing and interpreting data from visualizing charts and graphs, which has been helpful for me. In addition, Brilliant is constantly adding more of these lessons every month, so you will find the lessons and courses that apply to you no matter where you are on your educational journey. So if you are interested in checking out this amazing learning platform, go to brilliant.org/ia